The infamous Sicilian Mafia was often depicted as a shadowy underworld criminal organization by the outside world, something that everyone should fear and no one dared to stand against. But for most of the 20th century, Cosa Nostra's power and influence in Sicily wasn't shadowy at all. It was in fact a big part of the island's social and political environment. The origins of Cosa Nostra can be traced to the late 19th century, not long after Italy's unification in 1861. Sicily had always been a region where central Italian authority was weak, as politicians in Rome struggled to enforce control. Many Sicilians even believed that the Italian government had abandoned them. This power vacuum was eventually filled by local groups that emerged where they offered protection and arbitration in a society that deeply distrusted the central state. And over time, these groups became intermediaries between the people and the institutions that were supposed to govern them. This system eventually evolved into what became known as Cosa Nostra, and by the 1950s and 60s, the Mafia became deeply embedded in Sicily's post-war reconstruction, especially during the construction boom in Palermo. Many neighborhoods were reshaped entirely under Mafia influence, where building permits, contracts, land deals, and many other legal requirements had to pass through their hands. Politicians even had to play along because they needed Mafia-backed votes. Businessmen did as well because it was easier and often more profitable than resisting. In other words, if someone wanted to survive in Palermo's economy, sooner or later that person would end up dealing with the Mafia. This influence eventually created what many Italians later called omertà istituzionale, or institutional silence, because officially the state often either denied or downplayed the Mafia's existence, but in practice, it was tolerated since it kept certain interests intact, such as to secure votes, to guarantee lucrative public contracts, to maintain a corrupt social order, or even to generate massive profits for businesses connected to the ruling parties. The Mafia, in turn, received protection and impunity from local politicians. This mutual back-scratching deals eventually defined the Sicilian political scene for decades, and by the 1970s, this quote-unquote institutional silence allowed Cosa Nostra to expand even further. Sicily became a hub for the international heroin trade, where laboratories in rural areas processed morphine base from Turkey and then turned it into heroin for distribution to the United States and Europe. The profits were enormous, granting the Mafia financial power on a global scale. And with money came weapons, influence, and also a greater capacity for violence. Violence was always the core of the Mafia, but what made their control so effective was how they mixed fear with omertà, which is their enforced code of silence where everyone is threatened not to speak anything to authorities. They ruled less by daily bloodshed than by the threat of it. So businesses paid protection money not because they were attacked every week, but instead they paid because they knew what happened to those who refused. The real power of Cosa Nostra was largely psychological. Everyone knew the rules, and everyone who wanted to live peacefully had to play by them. This was the environment Giovanni Falcone stepped into as a young magistrate in Palermo in the late 1970s. But he was different because he didn't rely on the traditional approach of chasing suspects for individual crimes. He understood that the Mafia operated as a system with money at its core. So he pioneered the strategy of following financial records to trace how illicit profits flowed back into the legal economy. This method gave investigators a way to expose the larger structure instead of just prosecuting single murders or drug deals. Another key breakthrough of his work was his use of Mafia defectors, known in Italian as pentiti, which literally means the repentant ones. These were former Mafia members who decided to break the silence and cooperate with the state in exchange for reduced sentences or protection. This is important since no one inside Cosa Nostra had ever spoken publicly about its structure or rules, because breaking the code of silence was seen as a death sentence. One of the most important pentito was Tommaso Buscetta, who began cooperating in 1984. Although Buscetta didn't directly provide detailed organizational information, every testimony he gave became crucial evidence that Falcone carefully documented and cross-checked every detail until Buscetta's statements revealed the hierarchy and internal workings of Cosa Nostra. It was the first time in Italy's history that the Mafia could be described in court not as scattered gangs, but as a single organized and structured system with rules, ranks, leaders, and bosses. Falcone also worked with his best friend Paolo Borsellino and other colleagues in what became known as the Anti-Mafia pool, where they shared cases, evidence, investigations, person of interest, and even strategies, with the main intent of ensuring that no judge was left isolated. This collaborative model replaced the tradition of lone magistrates working alone and in silence, and it became one of the most effective shields against mafia infiltration. And from February 1986 to December 1987, Falcone helped organize the Maxi Trial in Palermo. A total of 338 mafiosi were convicted during this period, including 19 bosses who received life sentences. This trial eventually exposed the structure of Cosa Nostra in a way that had never been done before. But this came at a terrible cost, because all of his contributions in dismantling the Mafia made him not only hated, but also targeted by the Mafia. 4 months after the final verdicts of the Maxi trial were upheld on appeal, he was returning from Rome to Palermo on the sunny day of May 23, 1992, with his wife, Francesca Morvillo, who was also a judge. They landed at Punta Raisi Airport in the late afternoon and got into a small convoy. He was at the wheel of his white Fiat Croma with his wife beside him and a judicial driver named Giuseppe Costanza in the back seat who allowed him to take the wheel at his request. One car of police escort was in front of them and another one behind. Each had 3 escort agents inside. This was pretty much his standard security arrangement whenever he traveled in Sicily. What Falcone and the rest of his security teams didn't know was that, under the highway between the airport and Palermo, the Cosa Nostra had already planted around 500 kilograms of explosives. The site was chosen because it was a straight stretch of motorway near the town of Capaci, where cars would have to slow down for an upcoming curve. And on a hill 900 meters from the highway, a young Mafia member named Giovanni Buscetta was already stationed overlooking the road with a remote detonator. And when the convoy was approaching, he triggered the bombs. The explosion threw the lead escort car into the air, instantly killing Vito Schifani, Rocco De Cillo, and Antonio Montignaro. Falcone's car behind crashed violently into the debris and concrete separator. He and his wife were gravely injured and rushed to the hospital. Costanza in the back seat was badly injured and unconscious but survived. The third escort car was damaged, but all 3 police escorts inside survived with injuries. Around 20 civilians nearby were also hurt by the explosion. Falcone died about an hour later in the hospital at 7:05 p.m. due to serious internal hemorrhages, with his best friend Paolo Borsellino at his bedside in his last moments. His wife died 3 hours later during a surgery. Costanza, the survivor who sat in the back seat, later recalled that just a few moments before the explosion, Falcone noticed his house keys were in the ring along with his car keys, and he tried to remove them, which caused the vehicle to slow down. This was the reason why his car didn't end up like the lead car, and later investigations concluded that if only Falcone and his wife had been wearing their seatbelts, they might have survived this attack. This tragic event is broadly known as the Capaci Bombing. Italians even called it the Capaci Massacre, and the attack was prepared for months under the order of the highest levels of Cosa Nostra. As mentioned earlier, many senior mafia bosses were convicted for life sentences in the Maxi trial, which cut them off from their power networks. And because of this, Salvatore Riina, who was the boss of bosses, wanted to reassert control and retaliate against those who had made the convictions possible, meaning Falcone, more than anyone else, became the main retaliation target. But according to Borsellino, this wasn't really the case. He believed that the decision to kill Falcone was not related to what happened in the past, rather because he was just a step away from becoming the new national anti-mafia prosecutor. And judging by all the work he had done, the Mafia must have known that he would become the single greatest threat to their very existence. This attack also occurred just 4 days after Borsellino gave an interview to French investigative journalist Fabrizio Calvi and Jean-Pierre Moscardo from a French media Canal Plus. He spoke about how the Mafia's influence extended beyond Sicily, reaching into northern Italy's business and political world, as he explained in detail about Vittorio Mangano, who was a convicted mafioso whom investigators described as a bridgehead of Cosa Nostra in northern Italy. Mangano had been tied to Milan, and years earlier, he had even worked as a stable keeper at Silvio Berlusconi's villa, who just 2 years later in 1994 would become the Prime Minister of Italy. The journalist pressed Borsellino directly about Berlusconi and his associate Marcello Dell'Utri, asking if there were connections with Mangano, but Borsellino, being cautious as always, refused to make accusations on camera. He said there were ongoing investigations and reminded them that he was not the magistrate handling those cases. But he then added something important, that by the 1970s, the Mafia had become a business empire swimming in drug money, and it was normal that Cosa Nostra would try to channel that wealth into legitimate industries in the northern Italy. It was this wider picture about how the Mafia and big business and politicians moving closer together that made the interview so explosive. But for some unknown reason, the full interview was shelved and not aired until the year of 2000, when Rai News broadcasted only 30 minutes of the original 55. The news of Giovanni Falcone's death immediately dominated the national TV, even international TV. People saw clearly how armored cars completely deformed, and they understood in an instant what it meant: that the Mafia had declared war on the state in the most public way possible. In Palermo, thousands of people poured into the streets. Many of them had lived their entire lives under Omertà. But in those days after Falcone's murder, they broke the silence, especially after they heard the news that members of Cosa Nostra who were already imprisoned in the Ucciardone prison celebrated the attack. This provoked the crowds to gather outside courthouses and government buildings demanding action. And at funerals, grieving families shouted at politicians, accusing them of failing to protect those who stood up to Cosa Nostra. This accusation was not baseless at all because political leaders had downplayed Mafia influence for decades, but now it was impossible to deny the scale of the threat. And there was a sense, for the first time in many, many years, that public opinion might actually push the state into a real confrontation with the Mafia. But for those closest to Falcone, this tragic event was personal before it was political. Paolo Borsellino delivered speeches honoring him on multiple occasions. He told the public mainly about how Falcone had shown the country the way to fight the Mafia, while on the other hand, he also admitted something darker. He admitted that he knew his own time was running out. And he was right, because just 57 days later, on July 19, 1992, Paolo Borsellino was killed in another bombing. Borsellino went to visit his mother at her home on Via D'Amelio in Palermo that afternoon. His escort of 5 police officers accompanied him as they always did. But waiting nearby was a Fiat 126 loaded with explosives that the Mafia had parked. As soon as Borsellino approached the building, the car was detonated. The blast killed him instantly, along with all 5 members of his escort: Agostino Catalano, Walter Edi Cosina, Vincenzo Limuli, Claudio Traina, and Emanuela Loi. Borsellino knew that his days were numbered, and those who were close to him could see it in his eyes and behavior. He didn't even take the time off to mourn the death of his best friend. After attending the funerals, he went straight back into work to speed up the process of investigations he was working on. He also intentionally began to distance himself from his children, with the intention of softening the inevitable emotional shock when the day really came. The Via D'Amelio bombing came less than 2 months after Capaci, and it confirmed what everyone already feared, that the Mafia was not finished. They were sending a message not only to judges but to the entire country that anyone who seriously challenged Cosa Nostra could be eliminated. These events put Italy into crisis. The killings of Falcone and Borsellino back-to-back created a wave of public outrage unlike anything the country had experienced. In Palermo and across Sicily, ordinary citizens who had lived in silence for generations began openly protesting the mafia as they had become sick and tired with the culture of fear. The governments in Rome could no longer downplay or underestimate the mafia's power. With two of the country's most prominent judges assassinated in less than 2 months, public anger left them no choice. Parliament moved quickly to pass new emergency laws to strengthen the fight against organized crime. One of the most important was Article 41B's of the Prison Code, which allowed authorities to isolate convicted bosses in order to cut off their communication with the outside world. Assets linked to organized crime could now be seized more easily, and protections for witnesses and defectors were expanded, which gave investigators a more reliable flow of information from inside Cosa Nostra. And at the same time, security forces carried out mass arrests across the island of Sicily. Hundreds of suspected mafia members were detained in the months following the bombings. The state no longer treated the mafia as scattered criminals, but as a national security threat. The most significant breakthrough came less than a year later in January 1993, when Salvatore Riina was arrested in Palermo after nearly 23 years as a fugitive. His capture marked the first real sign that the mafia's power had limits, that even its most feared leader could be brought down. But the price had already been paid. Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino did not live to see these changes. Their deaths forced the state into a confrontation it had long avoided, and in that sense, the mafia's bombs backfired. Instead of silencing their work, they made it impossible for Italy to ignore. Falcone and Borsellino paid with their lives. So did Falcone's wife Francesca Morvillo and the police officers who stood guard at their side. May the world never forget their sacrifices, and may their souls rest in peace.